Here's Alex O'Connor to explain some weird things about the resurrection.
Trent has just defended Paul's use of the word spiritual in a way that would, like, spiritual body. He also, just to be clear, you mentioned Philippians, I think it's chapter 3, where Paul says, we will sort of take on a new body just like Christ. And you said Christ's physical body. The text doesn't say that. It says body, but it does not say physical body, just to be absolutely clear, right? I understand that the use of the word body there probably means something corporeal to most readers, but it's not clear. In the same way that Trent hears the word spiritual body and says, well, Paul kind of meant this. When I hear the use of the word body, I can say, well, they kind of mean this. My reading is that I just kind of don't really know about the nature of the resurrected body. That's from Paul, who never actually met the risen Jesus. This is the thing. This is the key thing.
Paul's encounter with Jesus is described in Acts as Paul hearing a voice that claimed to be the voice of Jesus. He didn't see a body. He certainly was not given the evidence that Thomas was given. He just heard a voice which could easily have been a hallucination or even just someone goofing on him.
Where can we go to find accounts of what the actual risen Jesus was actually like? Well, there are no eyewitness accounts. There are, at best, even if you agree with the traditional authorship of the Gospels, then maybe there are two, right? But what is the nature of some of the post-resurrection experiences that we're given? I mean, firstly, there's just the problem that our earliest Gospel doesn't have any at all, and the fact that as the dates get later for the Gospels, the stories get more, and they also get more fanciful, and they also get more theological.
So you're referring to Mark's Gospel there, where there's an allusion to an appearance to Peter in Galilee, but we don't have that appearance narrated.
Even if you believe that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were actually written by the apostles Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which they weren't, Mark's account is still hearsay. He doesn't claim to have seen Jesus resurrected with his own eyes.
That's right. I mean, Mark's Gospel, at least the earliest manuscripts of Mark's Gospel, end with the women fleeing, afraid, saying nothing.
Which makes no sense, because if they said nothing about what they saw, then how did the author of the Gospel find out about what they saw?
Okay, so there's this idea of having a new resurrected body. Got a couple of mysteries. Firstly, Jesus in John's Gospel is still said to have the stigmata, that is the wounds in the hands and the side. Right, to the extent that Thomas is allowed to see them, he's invited to see them. We don't know whether he actually touches them or not, so don't take that as evidence of physicality.
We don't know whether Caravaggio was correct.
In fact, he's almost certainly false in my view. It seems to me a better reading that as soon as Thomas is given the opportunity, bear in mind, people forget this, Jesus appears to the 11 and shows them his wounds. And they sort of believe in him. And then Thomas isn't among them. And then Thomas says, until I see the wounds. And we sort of lambast Thomas for not having enough faith, even though Jesus showed his wounds to the 11 first.
And then Jesus says, because you have seen, you believe. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe, as though gullibility should be rewarded and basing one's beliefs on evidence should not.
Jesus walking on the road to Emmaus in Luke's Gospel. One of the most extraordinary stories in the fact that the two disciples, Cleopas and the other one, don't recognize Jesus. And yet, when he sits down and breaks bread, they suddenly recognize him. Now, there could be some sort of miraculous intervention here, right? But looking at these as historical sources, it seems to me that this is the genre of mythology. I mean, I don't know if Trent believes the Road to Emmaus to be a historical story of something that actually happened. It seems to me definitely mythological. That's not to say false or made up. It's just to say it's a particular genre.
If it's mythological, wouldn't it also be fictional?
And certainly, if Jesus still had the wounds from his crucifixion, I think that a man who'd just undergone a brutal crucifixion a few days earlier would be noticeably recognizable as such. But it seems that Jesus' body is glorified. It seems that it's not something like, and yet when you get to John's Gospel, he's still got the wounds of his crucifixion, but I guess like only some of them. Yeah, okay, maybe God decided to give him like a new spiritual body, but kept the stigmata as some kind, like I think, Augustine and people like this write about how it was kind of like a trophy of his victory and stuff.
It is odd that nobody in Emmaus seemed to notice a guy walking around full of holes.
John, what's the most embarrassing verse of the New Testament?
It's the verse in the mini apocalypse in Mark, according to C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis says it's the most embarrassing verse.
This generation will pass away before all of these things take place.
Why is that so embarrassing? Because Mark says, some of you standing here today will not taste death until you see the kingdom and the Son of Man in his glory.
I imagine the standard apologist response to this is that the folks Jesus spoke to actually did see the kingdom and the Son of Man and all that, but just not literally. It was a metaphor for Jesus dying for everyone's sins or something. This is like when God says in Genesis that if Adam and Eve eat the fruit, then they shall die that day, which doesn't happen. Apologists equivocate on what God meant by die or what he meant by day. Any clear contradiction is spun as some kind of metaphor that represents something that isn't demonstrably nonsensical.
In Matthew's Gospel, when it says, they went to the mountain where Jesus told them to go, like, What mountain are we talking about? We're never told about this. It seems plausible that it's the same mountain as the Mount of Transfiguration, given that it's in Galilee. And not only that, but when they go up the mountain, which seems like a very specific place to see a physical person, why up the mountain, some of them doubted. Why would they doubt? If I, John, I've known you for years now. If you died and I saw you as I see you now, talking to me, as physical as you are, I might sort of go like, oh, I don't know if I can believe, but I would not be able to be convinced that it was you if it were not physically stood in front of me.
If I saw someone in front of me who I believed was dead, I just wouldn't be able to believe they ever really died in the first place.
Yet some of those disciples doubted. Whereas if I had some kind of visionary experience with a few other people and some said, I think that was John come back, I might say, you know what, I'm not sure about that, guys. Yeah. In other words, I think there are some hints there, but I don't know, that's a lot, and it's not really a point. Maybe Trent can expertly sieve out whatever points I might have made in there and see what he has to say to them.
Yeah, Trent, where would you like to take this?
I have a lot, so I think it's always prudent to work backwards from what we just heard, and we'll go back through a lot of the points that Alex raised. So when it comes to the Transfiguration, I think that was a physical, historical event. And I do think it's interesting that it's Moses and Elijah, because Elijah, the previous narrative in the Old Testament, said he was assumed bodily into heaven.
How do you go bodily into heaven? Wouldn't that require heaven to be a physical place with a physical location?
But there's also Jewish tradition that Moses' body was taken into heaven. Jude chapter 9 refers to the dispute between the archangel Gabriel and the devil over Moses' body. There's extra testamental evidence to a belief that Moses had also been taken up into heaven.
I think Philo talks about it.
Right. So I think that there could be evidence that, I think that holy people can be assumed into heaven. Moses, Elijah. As a Catholic, I think the Blessed Virgin Mary is up there bodily.
What does that mean, though? And what do you mean by up there? Do you believe that heaven is literally a physical location in the sky somewhere?
Which also explains these apparitions as well, or these appearances. So I think that's not problematic for me. And especially that Peter says, I want to build you tents. If you just see a vision of somebody in the sky, I find it interesting that if we're just making a grand theological investigation, what's interesting here is I like to compare that to, okay, well, when do we see myth-making? What does it look like? When you read like the Gospel of Peter, for example, when people go on an absolute myth-making binge, it's really, really over the top. That's from probably mid-2nd century.
That's the apocryphal gospel that portrays the cross itself as talking to people. I don't see why that's any more clearly a myth than a guy rising from the dead or healing the blind.
And you have all the Romans at the tomb, all of the Jews, the angels come down, they come out of the tomb, they're giants, Jesus comes out, he's like 500 feet tall. So that's a lot different than the more sober accounts, especially like what we see in Mark.
Yeah, a story about a guy who walked on water and rose from the dead sounds exactly like the kind of story you'd hear from a sober person.
So it's kind of funny that Mark's a bit more sober. We say, oh, well, he doesn't have all these appearances. Then if he did have a bunch, you'd say, that would just be a bunch of myth-making. So I worry if that's kind of catch 22 there.
Any story about a guy coming back from the dead at all is clearly myth-making.
I would say Mark is very clear.
Can I ask you, Trent, a clarifying question on that? Because, I mean, do you see apologetic features within the canonical gospel narratives themselves? You know, it's often pointed out, for example, that Matthew and Luke have a new tomb in which no one was laid, or John, a new tomb in which no one was laid. So do you find those same features within the Gospels, but it's just in a more sober form?
Yes, but just because there is an apologetic, it doesn't follow that it's a hollow defense or con artistry or trying to defend that which is false. Like Matthew very clearly describes an apologetic polemic that had been going on between Christians and Jews for some time about debating what happened to Jesus's body, with the Jews of his time arguing that the body had been stolen.
The Gospel of Matthew says that the tomb guards were paid to say that the body was stolen, but it also says that when the guards approached the tomb, the body was already gone. So even if they were paid to say it was stolen, if they never actually saw how the tomb was emptied, the story doesn't even contradict the possibility that the body was stolen.
And then the Christians saying, no, it wasn't, and because there were guards and other things like that.
Guards that found the tomb already empty when they got there, which is fully consistent with the body being stolen.
What wounds will he have?
Yeah.
I think that there's the 5 sacred wounds. They've talked about the wounds in the feet, the hands or wrists, and possibly abrasions around the head.
Not the one on his side?
it comes to, let's say, okay, you're saying, well, we got Paul, he's got the appearances. How do we know this wasn't just hallucination? That's where I depart from the mental facts people and saying, I think especially like Luke's description of these group appearances, I think Luke is a very reliable source when talking about things. So for example, just because something's recorded only in one place, it doesn't mean that's, it didn't happen anywhere else.
Well, there are some things that are recorded in only one place that would be very weird for the other gospel authors to leave out if they really happened. Like when Jesus said in John, I and the Father are one. Why would Matthew, Mark, and Luke not think that was important enough to mention? Similarly, why did the other gospel authors not think the group appearances were significant enough to mention?
Also, Luke, it was a traveling companion of Paul. I think that's very clear. So we get that helps back up, Paul's conversion experience, and that this wasn't just a private vision. People with him saw something, not the whole thing.
But not a bodily Christ, right?
Why? I don't know. He hears a voice. He says, who is it that I'm speaking to? Is I am Jesus who you're persecuting.
Yeah, and a voice is not a body, is it?
It shows, this is very interesting, that if you had a bunch of hopped up religious believers in the first century, I would have expected the apostles in their letters. It's always funny to see what they complain about, kind of indirectly reveals what's really going on here. I would expect them to say like, hey, these people claim Jesus spoke to them and said this. No. He only appeared to us. Don't run around with them. Because we even have people today, right, who say that Jesus appeared to them and told them stuff.
Quite.
And why should we take the account about Paul any more seriously? In fact, why should we take any account of a post-crucifixion Jesus seriously?
I agree with you. The argument, who would die for a lie, is a horribly bad one. It's a horrible argument because Muslim suicide bombers do that all the time. The Tamil Tigers, there's people who die for things that are a lie all the time.
I agree that the argument is bad, but this is a poor rebuttal to it. First of all, it's a straw man of the argument. The argument is that the apostles wouldn't die for a claim that they knew to be a lie. Secondly, I think the best rebuttal to that is that there are no records that say that a single one of the apostles were martyred specifically for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead. Some of them were arguably martyred for being followers of Jesus, but given that Jesus was crucified for rebelling against the Roman occupation of Judea, that seems like it would be more than enough of an explanation for why his followers would be martyred as well. Rome had a motivation to martyr them even if they never even claimed that Jesus rose from the dead.
The greater question is, who would die for something that they know is a lie?
That's the actual question that the folks who make the argument are asking.
That's the clear question. So in early Mormonism, I grant you, there are many, many Mormons who went out, were willing to endure persecution, things like that. But most of those people, if they weren't the original 11 witnesses, would not have been in a place to know whether it's true or false. So it doesn't say much.
Isn't that the same as the Gospels?
In that regard?
You just said you just said that there were lots of early believers who went out and were willing to be persecuted, but unless they were the original 11 witnesses, they wouldn't have seen it directly. I was actually unclear for a second whether you were talking about Mormonism or Christianity.
No, and I agree with you. So for me, the martyrdom or the risk of martyrdom for the apostles, and I disagree. I would recommend for our listeners, get Sean McDowell's book, The Fate of the Apostles. It's published by Routledge. It is an academic study on the fate of the 12 apostles. And he puts in very high historical confidence we can know that at least Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus, were martyred, and we have good evidence for some of the others as well.
But for what specifically? I've never even seen a record of any of their deaths that says that they were martyred specifically for their belief in the resurrection.
They do it for the fervency of communicating this message. The risk of martyrdom is something that is an argument for the sincerity of one's testimony. So I believe that the apostles were sincere.
Well, maybe they were sincere even before Jesus was crucified and before there was even a resurrection to believe in. And I think what they sincerely believed and preached at that time could have been what they were martyred for preaching about after the crucifixion. That would have been a far more sensible motivation for the Romans to martyr them than belief in zombies.
First Clement, as you know, Trent, as in Clement's first epistle, which is where this reference comes to Peter, says he says, let's consider the good apostles. He says, there was Peter who by reason of unrighteous jealousy endured not one but many labors, and thus having X went to his appointed place of glory. Now some people say been martyred, but as you know, Trent, this really just means borne his testimony. That's what the word means. I'm not saying that we know Peter wasn't martyred. But this idea of an early testimony in Clement, all Clement actually says is that he bore his testimony and then went to his appointed place of glory.
That doesn't sound to me like a very strong basis for inferring martyrdom. helps me out on Patreon. You're a big help. Thanks so much.